When Thomas Mitchell died, his golden Labrador Scout began a heartbreaking ritual that would puzzle everyone in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Every single morning, Scout walked 2 miles through busy streets to sit motionless beside his owner's grave at Greenwood Cemetery. For 3 months, the loyal dog refused food, ignored concerned neighbors, and grew thinner each day. Workers at the cemetery watched helplessly as Scout wasted away, standing guard over the man who had saved him as an abandoned puppy. But then, strange things started happening at Thomas's grave. Fresh flowers appeared overnight in a locked cemetery. An American flag was planted perfectly beside the headstone with no record of who put it there. Security cameras showed only Scout sitting alone, yet somehow new memorial items kept appearing. What cemetery groundskeeper Maria Santos discovered next would reveal a mystery spanning 50 years, connecting 2 dogs named Scout across generations of military service, love, and an unbreakable bond that death itself could not destroy. This is the true story of extraordinary loyalty, impossible devotion, and the day everything changed for one remarkable dog who proved that some promises transcend. The grave. The morning frost covered everything at Greenwood Cemetery like a thin white blanket. Maria Santos pulled her jacket tight as she walked through the rows of gray headstones. Her breath made small clouds in the cold February air. She had worked at this cemetery in Cedar Rapids, Iowa for 12 years. She knew every corner, every tree, every grave. But for the past 3 months, one sight broke her heart every single day. There he was, again. The golden Labrador sat perfectly still beside a simple granite headstone. His fur was dirty and wet from the morning dew. His brown eyes stared straight ahead, never moving. The dog had been there when Maria arrived at work. He would be there when she left at sunset. Maria walked closer to read the headstone again, even though she knew the words by heart. Thomas Mitchell, 1945 to 2022. Beloved husband and veteran. The dog's name was Scout. Maria had learned this from the neighbors who sometimes drove by looking for him. Scout belonged to Thomas Mitchell, the old man who was buried beneath this cold stone. Thomas had died on November 15, 2022. Scout had been sitting by his grave every day since the funeral. "Hello, Scout," Maria said softly. The dog's ears moved slightly, but he did not turn his head. His ribs showed through his golden coat. Dark circles ringed his eyes. He was getting thinner every week. Maria knelt down and opened her lunch bag. She pulled out half of her turkey sandwich and placed it near Scout's front paws. She also set down a small bowl and poured water from her thermos. "You need to eat something," she whispered. "Your Thomas wouldn't want you to waste away like this." Scout sniffed the sandwich, but did not eat it. He had not eaten anything Maria offered him in 3 months. Sometimes other people left food too. Scout never touched any of it. He only drank water when it rained, licking drops from the grass. Maria stood up and brushed dirt from her knees. She had watched Scout make this same 2-mile journey every morning. He walked from Thomas's old house on Elm Street, through busy downtown traffic, past the shopping mall, and straight to this grave. How he knew the way, Maria could not understand. Dogs were smart, but this seemed impossible. The house on Elm Street stood empty now. Thomas had no family nearby. His nephew in California had put the house up for sale after the funeral. Yet, somehow, Scout still lived there, coming and going as he pleased through a broken board in the back fence. People in the neighborhood had tried to catch Scout. Mrs. Chen from the diner brought him leftover bacon. Mr. Patterson from the hardware store tried to coax him with dog treats. Scout was always too quick for them. He seemed to know they wanted to take him away from his daily mission. Maria looked at her watch. It was almost 9 o'clock. Time to call her supervisor about the dead tree near Section C. But first, she needed to make another call. Scout was dying slowly, and she could not watch it happen anymore. She pulled out her phone and found the number for Cedar Rapids Animal Control. Her finger hovered over the call button. Once she made this call, they would come and take Scout away. He would be safe and fed, but he would be separated from Thomas forever. Scout seemed to sense what she was thinking. For the first time in weeks, he turned his head and looked directly at her. His brown eyes were so sad and tired. But there was something else there, too. Something that looked almost like understanding. Maria's heart ached. She had never seen such loyalty, such pure love. Scout was not just mourning his owner. He was standing guard, like a soldier who would never abandon his post. She was about to dial the number when something caught her eye. There, leaning against Thomas's headstone, was a small bouquet of fresh yellow daffodils. The flowers were bright and new, with drops of water still clinging to their petals. Maria frowned. She had been here since 7 that morning. No one had he visited except Scout. The flowers definitely had not been there yesterday when she locked the cemetery gates at sunset. She checked the visitor log every evening. No one had signed in after hours. "Where did these come from, Scout?" she asked. The dog's tail moved slightly, just once. Then he turned back to face the headstone, resuming his eternal watch. Maria stared at the flowers. They were Thomas's favorite kind. She remembered Eleanor Mitchell telling her that years ago, back when Eleanor was still alive. Thomas always brought Eleanor yellow daffodils for their anniversary. But who could have known that? And how did they get into a locked cemetery in the middle of the night? Maria put her phone away without making the call. Something strange was happening here. Something she needed to understand before she took Scout away from the only place that seemed to matter to him. As she walked back toward the maintenance shed, Maria glanced over her shoulder one more time. Scout sat motionless beside Thomas's grave, guardian and friend, keeping a promise that death itself could not break. The yellow daffodils swayed gently in the morning breeze. 5 years earlier, spring 2018, Thomas Mitchell stood behind the Hy-Vee grocery store on First Avenue, staring at a soggy cardboard box someone had left by the dumpster. Inside, a tiny golden puppy whimpered softly. The little dog was maybe 6 weeks old, with fur the color of summer wheat and eyes like chocolate drops. Thomas was 73 years old and had no business taking care of a puppy. His wife Eleanor had been dead for 2 months. His small house on Elm Street felt empty and cold. Most days, Thomas forgot to eat breakfast. Some nights, he forgot to turn on the lights. But something about this abandoned puppy reminded him of another dog from long ago. A brave golden retriever named Scout, who had saved Thomas's life in the jungles of Vietnam 50 years earlier. "Well, little guy," Thomas said, reaching into the box. "Looks like we're both lost." The puppy licked Thomas's weathered fingers with a tiny pink tongue. Thomas felt something stir in his chest that had been silent since Eleanor died. Hope, maybe, or purpose. Thomas carried the puppy home and named him Scout, after the war dog who had been his best friend in that terrible green hell across the ocean. This Scout was different from his namesake. Smaller, gentler, with no training for battle. But his eyes held the same intelligence, the same deep understanding that had made the first Scout so special. Thomas lived on his military pension and Social Security checks. His house needed paint and new shingles, but it was warm and dry. His only family was a nephew named David who lived in San Francisco and called maybe twice a year. Thomas had Eleanor's garden in the backyard and a comfortable chair where he could sit and remember better times. Scout changed everything. Every morning, Thomas and Scout walked 6 blocks to Betty's Diner on 2nd Street. Betty Chen had owned the little restaurant for 20 years. She always saved leftover bacon and sausage for Scout, who would sit patiently by Thomas's booth while the old man drank coffee and read the Cedar Rapids Gazette. "That's a smart dog you got there, Thomas," Betty would say, scratching Scout behind the ears. "He knows you need taking care of." After breakfast, they would walk to Veterans Park, where Thomas would throw tennis balls while Scout ran and fetched with endless energy. Other veterans gathered there too, men and women who had served in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. They understood each other without many words. Scout seemed to understand them all. Old Jake Morrison, who had lost his left leg in Desert Storm, always brought dog treats. Scout would sit perfectly still while Jake told stories about the bomb-sniffing dogs he had worked with in Kuwait. Martha Williams, one of only 3 women veterans in their group, had served as a Navy nurse. She would check Scout's ears and teeth, while explaining to Thomas how to keep his new friend healthy. "Dogs are healers," Martha always said. "They know when we're hurting inside." Thomas knew she was right. During his worst nightmares, the ones where he was back in the jungle, listening for enemy soldiers in the darkness, Scout would somehow wake up and rest his warm head on Thomas's chest. The dog's steady breathing would calm Thomas's racing heart. Dr. Sarah Kim at the Cedar Rapids VA Medical Center noticed the change in Thomas right away. For 2 years after Eleanor died, Thomas had struggled with depression and anxiety attacks, the memories of Vietnam mixed with grief for his wife. Until some days, he could barely function. "Bring Scout to your appointments," Dr. Kim suggested, after meeting the golden dog in the parking lot. "He's better medicine than anything I can prescribe." Scout seemed to know when Thomas's heart was acting up, long before Thomas felt the chest pains himself. The dog would whine softly and paw at Thomas's leg, forcing him to sit down and rest. 3 times, Scout's warning helped Thomas avoid serious heart attacks. In 2021, when Thomas's health began to fail more seriously, Scout became even more protective. He rarely left Thomas's side. When Thomas had to use a walker, Scout matched his pace exactly. When Thomas needed oxygen at night, Scout slept on the floor right beside the machine. The neighbors on Elm Street all knew Scout and Thomas. Mrs. Helen Rodriguez, who lived next door, often brought them homemade tamales. Scout loved children, and he would sit patiently while the Rodriguez grandchildren used him as a pillow during backyard barbecues. "That dog loves you more than life itself," Helen would tell Thomas. "You saved each other." Thomas knew she was right. Before Scout, Thomas had been dying slowly of loneliness and old wounds that would never heal. Scout gave him a reason to get up every morning, a purpose beyond just surviving another day. Through the fall of 2022, Thomas's heart grew weaker. He could no longer walk to the diner or the park. Scout never complained about the shorter walks around the block. He seemed to understand that his job now was simply to be there, to provide comfort and companionship. On November 10th, Thomas was admitted to the VA Medical Center for the last time. Scout waited on the front porch for 5 days, refusing to come inside even when it rained. Mrs. Rodriguez brought him food and water, but Scout barely ate. He just watched the street, waiting for his beloved Thomas to come home. Thomas Mitchell died quietly on November 15, 2022, with no family present. Dr. Kim was with him at the end, Thomas's last words were about Scout. "Tell him I'll be waiting," Thomas whispered. "Tell him he was the best friend an old soldier ever had." At the funeral 3 days later, Mrs. Rodriguez tried to keep Scout at home, but somehow the smart dog escaped from her backyard and showed up at Greenwood Cemetery just as the service began. Scout sat quietly during the entire ceremony, as if he understood that this was where his Thomas would stay forever. When the other mourners left, Scout remained. James Patterson, the cemetery director, tried to coax him away, but Scout would not budge. He had found his new post, and no one could convince him to abandon it. That was 3 months ago. Since then, Scout had walked the 2 miles from Thomas's empty house to this grave every single morning. Somehow, without ever having been there before, Scout had known exactly where to find his friend in this maze of headstones and monuments. Present, De Maria Santos stood in her office, staring at the yellow daffodils she had moved from Thomas's grave to a vase on her desk. The flowers were still fresh, still beautiful, still impossible to explain. She had worked at Greenwood Cemetery long, enough to know that mysteries usually had simple answers, but watching Scout's devotion for 3 months had taught her that some bonds between people and animals went deeper than anyone could understand. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was James Patterson, the cemetery director. "Maria, we need to talk about that dog," James said. "I just got off the phone with Animal Control. Officer Walsh is coming this afternoon to pick him up." Maria's heart sank. "But Mr. Patterson, Scout isn't hurting anyone. He just sits there." "He's dying, Maria. We can't let that happen on cemetery property. It's not fair to the dog, and it's not fair to our visitors." Maria hung up the phone and looked out her window toward Thomas's grave. Scout sat in his usual position, perfectly still, perfectly loyal. She thought about the mysterious flowers and wondered if there were other mysteries surrounding this remarkable dog that she had yet to discover. In a few hours, Officer Walsh would arrive, and Scout's vigil would end forever. But something told Maria that Scout's story was far from over. Officer Ryan Walsh parked his white Animal Control truck at the cemetery entrance at exactly 2 o'clock. He was a tall man with kind eyes who had been catching stray animals in Cedar Rapids for 8 years. This job was different, though. This wasn't just another loose dog case. Maria Santos met him at the gate, her face worried and sad. "He's been there since dawn," Maria said, pointing toward Thomas's grave. "Same as every day for 3 months." Ryan had heard about Scout from other officers. The story of the loyal dog who wouldn't leave his owner's grave had spread through the police department and city offices. Some people thought it was beautiful. Others thought it was just sad. "Has anyone tried to catch him before?" Ryan asked as they walked between the headstones. "Neighbors have tried. He's too smart and too fast. But he's getting weaker every day. I don't think he could run anymore even if he wanted to." They reached Thomas Mitchell's grave, and Ryan stopped, in surprise. Scout sat perfectly still beside the headstone, just as Maria had described. But there was something else that made Ryan's breath catch in his throat. A small American flag stood in the ground next to the grave marker. The flag was clean and new, planted perfectly straight. The red, white, and blue fabric moved gently in the afternoon breeze. "Did you put that flag there?" Ryan asked. Maria shook her head. "I've never seen it before. When I checked this morning, there were just the yellow flowers." Ryan looked around the cemetery. "What flowers?" "The daffodils I told you about on the phone. The ones that appeared overnight." Maria pointed to her office building. I moved them to my office because I couldn't figure out where they came from. Ryan knelt down and examined the flag more closely. It was the type used by the VFW to honor veteran graves on Memorial Day and Veterans Day. But this flag was completely dry, even though the morning dew still covered the grass all around it. "This doesn't make sense," Ryan muttered. "Everything else is wet from the dew, but this flag is bone dry." He reached out slowly to touch Scout. The dog's fur was damp and cold. His ribs showed clearly through his golden coat. But Scout didn't move or react to Ryan's gentle touch. "How long has he been sitting exactly like this?" Ryan asked. "Hours. He never moves during the day. Sometimes people see him walking around at night, but during daylight, he just sits and watches the grave." Ryan stood up and pulled out his phone. He called the Cedar Rapids VFW Post 1342. "This is Officer Walsh with Animal Control," he said when someone answered. "Did anyone from your post place flags at Greenwood Cemetery recently?" After a brief conversation, Ryan hung up with a puzzled expression. "They haven't been to this cemetery since Thomas Mitchell's funeral in November," he told Maria. "They have no record of anyone placing flags here." Ryan walked around the grave, looking for clues. The ground was soft from recent rain, but he saw no footprints except Maria's and his own. Scout's paw prints led from the cemetery entrance to the grave, but there were no human footprints anywhere near the flag. "Maria, do you have security cameras?" "Just one, at the main gate. It only shows people coming and going, not what happens back here." Ryan made a decision that surprised himself. "I'm going to stay and watch Scout for 24 hours before I take him. Something strange is happening here, and I want to understand what." That evening, Ryan set up a folding chair 50 yards from Thomas's grave. He had brought a thermos of coffee, sandwiches, and a small digital camera with night vision. If someone was placing these items at the grave, he was going to find out who. At sunset, Maria locked the cemetery gates and went home. Ryan settled in for a long night of watching. Scout hadn't moved in 6 hours. Around 10 o'clock, clouds covered the moon, and the cemetery became very dark. Ryan could barely see Scout's golden form beside the headstone. He turned on his night vision camera and pointed it toward the grave. At exactly 2:17 a.m., something incredible happened. Scout stood up for the first time all day. The dog looked around carefully, as if making sure he was alone. Then he began walking away from Thomas's grave. Ryan followed as quietly as he could, using the camera to track Scout's movements. The dog moved through the cemetery like he had memorized every headstone, every tree, every path. He never hesitated or seemed confused, even in the complete darkness. Scout walked for exactly 47 minutes through the maze of graves. Ryan lost sight of him twice when Scout disappeared behind large monuments. When Scout finally returned to Thomas's grave, he was carrying something small in his mouth. Through the camera's green night vision screen, Ryan watched Scout gently place a fresh red rose beside the headstone. The dog arranged the flower carefully next to the American flag, then returned to his sitting position. Ryan was amazed. Where had Scout found a fresh rose in the middle of the night? And how had he navigated through hundreds of graves in total darkness? The next morning, Ryan studied the footage on his camera. He could see Scout leaving the grave clearly, but the camera couldn't follow him through the entire cemetery. For 47 minutes, Scout had simply vanished into the darkness. Ryan decided to investigate where Scout might have found the rose. He drove to every flower shop in Cedar Rapids. At Sunset Flowers on First Avenue, the owner, Mrs. Paula Garcia, had an EIB. Interesting story. "Someone has been taking roses from our outdoor display for weeks," Mrs. Garcia said. "They always leave $5, which is exactly what we charge. But our security camera never shows who does it." Ryan looked at the shop's security footage. At 2:33 a.m., exactly when Scout had disappeared from Ryan's camera, the flower shop's camera showed an empty sidewalk. But somehow, one rose had been taken from the display and $5 had been left in its place. "This is impossible," Ryan said to himself. "Dogs don't have money. Dogs can't make purchases." But the evidence was right in front of him. Scout had somehow obtained fresh flowers and placed them at Thomas's grave. The dog had also somehow acquired an American flag and positioned it perfectly. Ryan drove back to the cemetery, his mind spinning with questions. He found Scout in his usual position, sitting motionless beside Thomas's grave. The red rose from the night before was already wilting in the morning sun. Ryan called his supervisor to request more time before removing Scout. He also called the Cedar Rapids Police Department and asked them to check Thomas Mitchell's military records. "I need to know everything about this veteran," Ryan told Detective Lisa Chen. "Something about his service record might explain what's happening with his dog." 2 hours later, Detective Chen called back with information that made Ryan's hands shake as he wrote it down. Thomas Mitchell served in Vietnam from 1968 to 1970, Detective Chen reported. He was part of a classified reconnaissance unit. Most of his service record is sealed, but there's a note about an incident in 1969 involving his Scout dog. The incident was so unusual that military intelligence investigated it. Ryan looked at Scout, who was still sitting perfectly still beside Thomas's grave. "What kind of incident?" Ryan asked. "I can't get the details without special clearance," Detective Chen said. But the dog's name was also Scout, and according to the records, that dog did something impossible that saved Thomas's entire unit. Ryan hung up the phone and stared at the golden Labrador, who had somehow learned to buy flowers in the middle of the night. A dog who could navigate a dark cemetery like he had memorized every inch of it. A dog whose loyalty went far beyond anything Ryan had ever seen. "What aren't you telling me, Scout?" Ryan whispered. "What did you learn from your namesake 50 years ago?" Scout's ears twitched slightly, but he didn't turn around. He just kept watching Thomas's grave, guardian and friend, carrying on a tradition of service that apparently ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Ryan Walsh spent the next morning making phone calls, getting information about classified military. Operations wasn't easy, but he knew someone who might help. His Uncle Bob had served in the Army for 30 years before retiring as a master sergeant. Uncle Bob knew people who knew people. "You need to talk to Colonel Patricia Williams at the Pentagon," Uncle Bob told Ryan over the phone. "She handles requests for old military records. Tell her I sent you." 2 hours later, Ryan was on the phone with Colonel Williams. She had a crisp, professional voice that reminded Ryan of his old high school principal. Thomas Mitchell's unit was part of Operation Phoenix Wing, Colonel Williams explained, after Ryan convinced her this was important. "Most of those records are still classified, but I can tell you some basic facts." Ryan grabbed a pen and notebook. "I'm listening." Mitchell's reconnaissance team was trapped behind enemy lines in the Mekong Delta region of Vietnam in August 1969. 7 soldiers and 1 Scout dog. They were cut off from their unit for 6 days with no radio contact. Ryan looked out his truck window at Scout, who hadn't moved from Thomas's grave all morning. "What happened to them?" "They all survived, which was considered miraculous." The terrain was thick jungle. The area was crawling with enemy forces. They had very little food or ammunition. "What about the dog?" Ryan asked. Colonel Williams paused. The dog's behavior during those 6 days was so unusual that Army intelligence opened an investigation. The animal seemed to possess knowledge and abilities that went far beyond normal military training. What kind of abilities? The scout dog led the team through areas he had never seen before, avoiding enemy patrols with perfect accuracy. He found hidden supply caches left by other American units weeks earlier. The dog seemed to understand complex hand signals that he had never been taught. Ryan's pen stopped moving. That sounds impossible. That's what the investigators thought too. They spent 3 months studying that dog. They interviewed every soldier in the unit multiple times. No one could explain how the animal knew things he couldn't possibly know. Did they reach any conclusions? Officially? The report stated that the dog had received exceptional training and possessed unusual intelligence. Unofficially? Colonel Williams lowered her voice. Some of those investigators believed they had witnessed something that military science couldn't explain. Ryan thought about Scout's nighttime journey through the cemetery, navigating perfectly in complete darkness. What happened to the dog? Tom died saving the unit from a sniper attack on their last day in enemy territory. The dog attacked the sniper and was killed instantly. Thomas Mitchell was wounded in the same incident and received a Purple Heart. After the call ended, Ryan sat in his truck for a long time, staring at his notes. A scout dog in Vietnam had done impossible things 50 years ago. Now another scout was doing impossible things in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Ryan decided to talk to Dr. Sarah Kim at the VA Medical Center. If anyone understood Thomas Mitchell's connection to his dogs, it would be his doctor. Dr. Kim met Ryan in her office at the VA hospital. She was a small woman with gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Thomas talked about both of his scout dogs constantly, Dr. Kim said, after Ryan explained why he was there. He believed the connection between him and his animals went deeper than training or normal pet bonding. What do you mean? Thomas claimed that his dogs could sense things before they happened. The scout in Vietnam apparently knew where enemy soldiers were hiding before the unit encountered them. Our scout here in Cedar Rapids could predict Thomas's heart episodes hours before they occurred. Ryan remembered what Colonel Williams had said about the original scout finding supply caches. Did Thomas ever explain how this was possible? Dr. Kim opened a thick file folder. Thomas kept detailed journals about both dogs. He believed that animals, especially dogs who bond closely with their handlers, can develop what he called extended awareness. They pick up on subtle cues that humans miss. But surely there are limits to that. Thomas didn't think so. He told me that Scout, our scout, always seemed to know when Eleanor's spirit was near. The dog would stare at Eleanor's empty chair and wag his tail as if someone were sitting there. Dr. Kim pulled out several pages from Thomas's file. In his final weeks, Thomas became convinced that Eleanor was communicating with him through Scout. He said Scout would lead him to places where he and Eleanor had shared special memories. Ryan thought about the yellow daffodils and the American flag appearing at Thomas's grave. Did you believe him? I've been treating veterans for 20 years, Officer Walsh. I've learned not to dismiss things just because I can't explain them. The bond between soldiers and their service animals often transcends what we think is scientifically possible. That afternoon, Ryan returned to the cemetery with a new plan. Instead of trying to catch Scout, he was going to follow him again. But this time, he would use multiple cameras and track Scout's entire journey. Ryan placed small motion-activated cameras at various points throughout the cemetery. He also borrowed a high-powered night vision scope from his friend, who worked for the sheriff's department. As the sun set, Ryan took his position 50 yards from Thomas's grave. Scout sat motionless in his usual spot, silhouetted against the darkening sky. At 2:15 a.m., Scout stood up and began his mysterious journey. This time, Ryan was ready. Through the night vision scope, he watched Scout walk confidently through the maze of headstones. The dog moved like he was following a well-known path, even though the cemetery was pitch black. Scout's route took him to the older section of the cemetery, where the headstones were smaller and harder to read. Ryan lost sight of him behind a large oak tree for several minutes. When Scout reappeared, he was carrying something in his mouth again. But this time, it wasn't a flower. Through the green glow of the night vision scope, Ryan watched Scout place a small object beside Thomas's headstone. The dog arranged it carefully next to the wilted rose from the night before, then returned to his sitting position. At dawn, Ryan approached the grave to see what Scout had brought. Lying on the ground was a small military medal on a faded ribbon. Ryan recognized it immediately. A Purple Heart, exactly like the one Thomas Mitchell had earned in Vietnam. Ryan's hands trembled as he picked up the medal. It was real, not a reproduction. The back was engraved with a service number, but not Thomas's number. Ryan spent the morning calling military records offices and veteran organizations. Finally, a clerk at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis gave him the information he needed. That service number belongs to Corporal James Patterson. The clerk reported he died in Vietnam in 1970. Ryan's blood ran cold. James Patterson was also the name of the cemetery director at Greenwood. But the cemetery director was very much alive and had never served in Vietnam. Ryan drove to the cemetery office and found James Patterson working at his desk. "Mr. Patterson, I need to ask you about something strange. Do you know anyone named James Patterson who died in Vietnam?" The cemetery director looked up with surprise. "That was my uncle. He was killed just before the war ended." "Why do you ask?" Ryan showed him the Purple Heart medal. "Scout brought this to Thomas Mitchell's grave last night. It has your uncle's service number on it." James Patterson stared at the medal in shock. "That's impossible. My uncle's Purple Heart was buried with him right here in this cemetery. Section D, Plot 127. Can you show me his grave?" 10 minutes later, Ryan and James Patterson stood beside a weathered headstone that read, "James Patterson, 1947-1970, beloved nephew and hero." The grave looked undisturbed, but Ryan noticed something that made his heart race. Fresh paw prints in the soft dirt around the headstone. Scout's paw prints. "Officer Walsh," James Patterson said in a shaky voice, "my uncle served in the same unit as Thomas Mitchell in Vietnam. They were best friends. Uncle James died trying to save Thomas's scout dog from that sniper attack." Ryan looked back toward Thomas's grave, where Scout sat keeping his eternal vigil. The puzzle pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was more impossible than anything Ryan had imagined. Scout wasn't just mourning his owner. He was somehow connected to a network of relationships and memories that stretched back 50 years. The dog was honoring not just Thomas, but all the soldiers and animals who had served together in that jungle war. But how was Scout accessing graves and obtaining medals from buried veterans? And why was he choosing these specific items to honor? Thomas's memory? Ryan realized he needed to dig deeper into the connections between Thomas, his original scout, and the other soldiers who had served with them. Something told him that the biggest revelation was still to come. As he walked back toward his truck, Ryan noticed Scout turn his head slightly and look directly at him. For just a moment, the dog's brown eyes seemed to hold a depth of understanding that no animal should possess. Then Scout turned back to face Thomas's grave. Resuming his watch over secrets that spanned decades, and reached beyond the grave itself. Ryan Walsh couldn't sleep that night. He kept thinking about the Purple Heart medal and the paw prints around James Patterson's uncle's grave. How could a dog dig up a buried medal without disturbing the ground around it? And why would Scout choose that specific grave out of hundreds in the cemetery? The next morning, Ryan called the Cedar Rapids Historical Society. If there were connections between Thomas Mitchell and other veterans buried at Greenwood Cemetery, someone there might know about them. Margaret Foster answered the phone at the Historical Society. She was 85 years old and had lived in Cedar Rapids her entire life. Her memory was sharp as a tack, and she knew the story of every family in town. "Thomas Mitchell?" Margaret said when Ryan mentioned the name. "Oh yes, I knew Thomas and Eleanor well. Eleanor volunteered at our animal shelter for many years before she died." Ryan's pen stopped moving. Eleanor worked with animals? She was wonderful with dogs, especially the pregnant strays that people would abandon. Eleanor had a gift for helping scared animals feel safe. Mrs. Foster, did Eleanor ever mention a specific dog she was caring for in 2018? Margaret was quiet for a moment, thinking. "That's an interesting question, Officer Walsh. Let me check my records." Ryan heard papers rustling in the background. "Here it is," Margaret said. In early 2018, Eleanor was caring for a pregnant golden retriever at the shelter. The poor thing had been living on the streets for weeks. Eleanor was very worried about her. Ryan's heart started beating faster. What happened to the dog? Eleanor died suddenly of a stroke in March 2018. She had been planning to foster the pregnant dog at her home, but she passed away before the puppies were born. Do you know what happened to the pregnant dog after Eleanor died? That's the strange part. The dog escaped from the shelter 2 days after Eleanor's funeral. We searched everywhere but never found her. About a week later, someone reported finding puppies behind the Hy-Vee grocery store. Ryan's hands were shaking now. Scout had been found behind that same grocery store exactly 1 week after Eleanor died. Mrs. Foster, where was Eleanor buried? Right there at Greenwood Cemetery, in the same section where Thomas is buried now. Eleanor always said she wanted to be close to the animals she had helped. Ryan thanked Margaret and hung up the phone. He drove straight to the cemetery and found Maria Santos working near the maintenance shed. "Maria, I need to see Eleanor Mitchell's grave," Ryan said. "That's easy. It's about 3 sections over from Thomas's grave." "Why? Just show me, please." They walked through the cemetery until Maria stopped beside a modest headstone that read, "Eleanor Mitchell, 1950-2018, beloved wife and friend to all creatures." The grave was perfectly maintained. Fresh flowers lay beside. The headstone, yellow daffodils, just like the ones that had appeared at Thomas's grave. "Maria, have you ever seen Scout visit this grave?" "I've never followed him around the cemetery at night, but now that you mention it, sometimes I find fresh flowers here that I can't explain either." Ryan knelt down and examined the ground around Eleanor's grave. There, clear as day, were Scout's paw prints in the soft earth. "He's been visiting both graves," Ryan said quietly. "Thomas and Eleanor." That evening, Ryan positioned himself where he could watch both Thomas's and Eleanor's graves. He had borrowed more equipment from the sheriff's department, including cameras that could track movement across the entire cemetery. At exactly 2:15 a.m., Scout began his nightly journey. This time, Ryan was ready to follow his complete route. Scout walked directly to Eleanor's grave first. Ryan watched through his night vision scope as the dog began digging carefully beside Eleanor's headstone. But Scout wasn't digging randomly. He seemed to know exactly where to dig. After several minutes, Scout uncovered a small, waterproof container buried about 2 feet underground. Ryan watched in amazement as Scout opened the container with his teeth and removed several items. Through the scope, Ryan could see Scout examining the contents carefully. The dog selected some items and left others, then reburied the container exactly where he had found it. Scout carried the selected items to Thomas's grave and arranged them carefully around the headstone. Then he returned to Eleanor's grave and smoothed the dirt back into place, leaving no sign that he had been digging. At dawn, Ryan approached Thomas's grave to see what Scout had brought. Scattered around the headstone were several old photographs, some handwritten letters tied with a faded ribbon, and a small dog collar with a brass nameplate. Ryan picked up one of the photographs. It showed a young Thomas in his army uniform standing next to a beautiful woman with dark hair. On the back, someone had written, "Thomas and Eleanor, 1970. The letters were love letters Thomas had written to Eleanor from Vietnam. The dog collar bore the name Buddy, apparently Thomas and Eleanor's first dog together from many years ago. But how had Scout known these items were buried there? And how had he opened a waterproof container that would challenge most humans? Ryan called Dr. Sarah Kim at the VA Medical Center and told her what he had witnessed. Officer Walsh, Thomas mentioned Eleanor's memory box several times during our sessions, Dr. Kim said. He told me Eleanor had buried special mementos somewhere safe, but he never said where. Did Thomas know about this burial spot? He said Eleanor had shown him where she hid their precious memories, but his memory wasn't clear about the details. The dementia was starting to affect him in his final months. Ryan thought about everything he had learned. Scout had somehow inherited knowledge about Thomas and Eleanor's most precious possessions. The dog was not just mourning, he was curating their love story, bringing their memories together at Thomas's grave. But there was still one question that bothered Ryan. How had Scout learned to do these things? Dogs, no matter how intelligent, don't naturally understand the concept of buried treasure or memorial ceremonies. That afternoon, Ryan decided to research Scout's breed and background more carefully. He called every animal shelter, veterinarian, and pet store in the Cedar Rapids area. Dr. Jennifer Walsh at the Cedar Valley Animal Hospital had interesting information. I remember treating a pregnant golden retriever in early 2018, Dr. Walsh told Ryan. The dog had been living on the streets, but she was remarkably well trained. Someone had spent a lot of time teaching her commands. Do you remember anything unusual about her? She was incredibly intelligent. She seemed to understand everything we said to her. And she had this unusual behavior. She would arrange her toys and food in very specific patterns, almost like she was performing some kind of ritual. What happened to her puppies? I only saw one of them. A family brought in a male puppy they had found behind a grocery store. Beautiful golden retriever with the most intelligent eyes I had ever seen in such a young dog. Ryan's heart raced. Do you remember the family's name? I don't think they kept the puppy. They said they couldn't care for him and were looking for someone who could. Ryan drove back to Elm Street and knocked on Mrs. Rodriguez's door. Eleanor's former neighbor invited him in and served him coffee while he explained what he was investigating. Eleanor found Scout when he was very young, Mrs. Rodriguez confirmed. But she didn't find him behind the grocery store like Thomas always said. Where did she find him? Mrs. Rodriguez walked to her kitchen window and pointed toward the cemetery, which was visible in the distance. Eleanor found that puppy right here in my backyard, sitting next to an old army blanket that had belonged to Thomas. The blanket had been stored in my garage for years after Eleanor and Thomas moved next door. An army blanket? Thomas's blanket from Vietnam. Eleanor had washed it and stored it when they got married. She said it still smelled like Thomas's first Scout. the dog from the war. Ryan stared out the window toward Greenwood Cemetery. The two pieces of an impossible puzzle were finally coming together. Scout hadn't just inherited his name from Thomas's war dog. He had been born into a legacy of loyalty and service that connected him to both Thomas and Eleanor in ways that defied explanation. But the biggest mystery still remained. How did Scout know about the buried memory box? And how had he learned to perform these elaborate memorial rituals? Ryan realized that to understand Scout's behavior, he needed to learn more about the original Scout, the war dog whose courage and intelligence had saved Thomas's unit 50 years ago. As the sun set over Cedar Rapids, Ryan watched Scout take his position beside Thomas's grave for another night of vigil. The dog's behavior was no longer just touching. It was revealing a story of love, loyalty, and connection that spanned generations. Tomorrow, Ryan would start digging into military records again. He had a feeling that the original Scout story held the key to understanding everything that was happening now. The next morning, Ryan drove to the oldest section of Greenwood Cemetery. If Thomas had brought his war dog's body home from Vietnam, the grave would be somewhere in the area where pets were buried in the 1970s. Ryan searched for an hour before he found it. A small, weathered stone marker that simply read, Scout, 1963-1970, faithful friend. The grave sat under a large oak tree, surrounded by other pet memorials from decades past. Ryan knelt down and examined the ground around Scout's grave. Just as he expected, there were fresh paw prints in the soft earth. The current Scout had been visiting this grave too. Ryan called James Patterson, the cemetery director, and asked him to meet at the old grave site. "I never knew this was here," James Patterson said when he arrived. Pet burials weren't well documented back then. "According to your records, who paid for this burial?" James checked his old ledger books. Thomas Mitchell paid for the burial plot and headstone in 1970. He also paid for perpetual care, which means the cemetery maintains this grave forever. Ryan looked at the dates again. Thomas's first Scout had died in 1970. Thomas had married Eleanor in 1971. For over 40 years, Thomas had been visiting this grave, probably bringing Eleanor with him after they were married. "Mr. Patterson, I need to ask you something that might sound crazy. Is it possible that Thomas brought his current Scout to visit this grave?" "Actually, yes. I saw Thomas here several times over the years with his golden retriever. The dog would sit very quietly while Thomas talked to the grave. I always thought it was sweet." Ryan called Dr. Sarah Kim and asked her to meet him at the cemetery. When she arrived, Ryan showed her the original Scout's grave. "Thomas mentioned this place many times," Dr. Kim said. "He told me he brought his new Scout here to meet his predecessor." Thomas believed the two dogs shared some kind of connection. What did Thomas mean by that? Dr. Kim pulled out her notes from Thomas's medical file. Thomas was convinced that his new Scout had inherited traits from the original Scout. Not just physical traits, but behavioral ones. He said the young dog seemed to understand things he had never been taught. Ryan thought about everything he had learned. The pregnant golden retriever that Eleanor had cared for had escaped from the shelter and given birth to her puppies on Thomas's old army blanket, the same blanket that had covered the original Scout in Vietnam. Dr. Kim, is it possible for animals to inherit learned behaviors through scent or other environmental factors? There's research suggesting that animals can inherit stress responses and certain behaviors through what scientists call epigenetic inheritance. But what you're describing would be far beyond anything documented in scientific literature. Ryan realized he needed to understand exactly what the original Scout had done in Vietnam that was so extraordinary. he called Colonel Patricia Williams, again, and convinced her to give him more details about the classified mission. The original scout displayed what can only be described as supernatural awareness, Colonel Williams said, after Ryan explained why he needed the information. The dog seemed to know things before they happened. Can you be more specific? Scout would lead the unit away from areas where enemy soldiers would appear hours later. He found hidden supply caches by walking directly to them, as if he had a map in his head. Most remarkably, he seemed to understand the emotional state of every soldier in the unit. What do you mean? When soldiers were about to break down from stress, Scout would stay close to them and provide comfort. When someone was injured, Scout would find them even in dense jungle. The dog appeared to have an emotional intelligence that went far beyond normal animal behavior. Ryan asked the question that had been bothering him most. Colonel Williams, how did the original scout die? He saved the entire unit from a sniper attack. Somehow, Scout knew exactly where the sniper was hiding, even though the enemy soldier was completely concealed. Scout attacked the sniper's position and was killed instantly, but his sacrifice allowed the unit to escape. Was Thomas Mitchell wounded in that attack? Yes. Thomas tried to save Scout and was shot in the process. He carried the dying dog for 2 miles through enemy territory before reaching safety. Thomas refused medical treatment until Scout was pronounced dead. Ryan hung up the phone and sat quietly in his truck, staring at the original Scout's grave. Thomas had loved that war dog so much that he brought the body home and visited the grave for 50 years. When Thomas found a new puppy, he named him Scout and brought him to this grave to honor his predecessor. But somehow, the connection between the two dogs had become something deeper than just memory and training. Ryan called Maria Santos and asked her to meet him at Eleanor's grave. Maria, I need to understand something. You said you sometimes find fresh flowers at Eleanor's grave that you can't explain. How long has that been happening? For about 5 years, Maria said. Ever since, Thomas started bringing Scout to visit Eleanor's grave regularly. Thomas brought Scout to Eleanor's grave while Thomas was still alive? Oh yes, especially after Thomas got sick. Scout would sit by Eleanor's grave while Thomas talked to her. Sometimes Thomas would leave flowers, but sometimes I would find flowers there when neither of them had visited. Ryan realized that Scout had been learning this ritual behavior from Thomas himself. The dog had watched Thomas honor both Eleanor and the original Scout for years. When Thomas died, Scout simply continued the traditions he had observed. But that still didn't explain how Scout knew about Eleanor's buried memory box, or how he could open containers and arrange objects so carefully. Ryan decided to spend one more night watching Scout's complete ritual. This time, he positioned cameras at Thomas's grave, Eleanor's grave, and the original Scout's grave. At 2:15 a.m., Scout began his journey. But instead of going to Eleanor's grave first, Scout walked directly to the original Scout's grave under the oak tree. Ryan watched through his night vision scope as Scout sat perfectly still beside the war dog's grave for exactly 10 minutes. The dog appeared to be listening to something, though Ryan heard only silence. Then Scout walked to Eleanor's grave and retrieved items from the buried memory box, just as Ryan had seen before. But this time, Scout selected different items: AED, small American flag, and a faded photograph of Thomas in his army uniform. Scout carried these items to Thomas's grave and arranged them carefully. Then he returned to the original Scout's grave and sat for another 10 minutes before taking his final position beside Thomas's headstone. Ryan studied the footage for hours the next morning. Scout's behavior followed a precise pattern that suggested ritual and purpose. not random wandering. The dog was performing a ceremony that honored all three members of his extended family: Thomas, Eleanor, and the original Scout. Dr. Kim arrived at the cemetery that afternoon with news that finally explained everything. "Officer Walsh, I found something in Thomas's medical files that I had overlooked before." Thomas wrote detailed instructions for Scout's care in case of his death. Dr. Kim showed Ryan a handwritten letter from Thomas. Thomas wanted Scout to continue visiting Eleanor's grave and to honor the original Scout's memory. He even drew a map showing Scout the locations of all three graves and described the items buried with Eleanor. Ryan stared at the letter. Thomas trained Scout to do all of this? Thomas spent months teaching Scout these rituals. He wanted to make sure that if anything happened to him, Scout would continue caring for Eleanor's memory and honoring the original Scout's sacrifice. But how could Scout remember such complex instructions? Thomas used the same training methods the military uses with service dogs: repetition, reward, and emotional bonding. Scout learned these behaviors because they were connected to his love for Thomas. Ryan finally understood. Scout's extraordinary abilities weren't supernatural. They were the result of love, dedication, and careful training. Thomas had taught Scout to be a guardian of memories, a living memorial to all the love and loyalty that had shaped Thomas's life. The mysterious flowers, flags, and medals weren't appearing by magic. Scout was retrieving them from various locations throughout the cemetery, where Thomas had hidden them over the years, preparing for the day when Scout would need to carry on these traditions alone. Thomas knew he was dying, Dr. Kim explained. He spent his final months teaching Scout everything he would need to know to honor the people and animals Thomas had loved. Ryan looked across the cemetery toward Thomas's grave, where Scout sat in his eternal vigil. The dog wasn't just mourning his owner, he was fulfilling a sacred duty that Thomas had entrusted to him. Scout had learned to be more than a pet. He had become a keeper of memories, a guardian of love stories, and a living bridge between the past and present. As the sun set over Greenwood Cemetery, Ryan made a decision that would change everything. Instead of taking Scout to the animal shelter, he was going to help Scout complete his mission. But first, he needed to find someone who could give Scout the home he deserved while still allowing him to continue his important work. Ryan had an idea about who that someone might be. Ryan Walsh drove slowly down Elm Street, looking for the house with the red mailbox that Mrs. Rodriguez had described. He found it 3 blocks from Thomas's old home. A small, neat house with flower boxes in the windows and an American flag hanging by the front door. Mrs. Helen Rodriguez answered the door before Ryan could knock. She was a small woman in her 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes that reminded Ryan of his own grandmother. "Officer Walsh," she said, "I've been watching you at the cemetery for weeks. I was wondering when you would come to see me." Helen invited Ryan into her living room, which was filled with photographs of family and friends. On the mantel sat a framed picture of a young woman in a Navy uniform. "That's me in 1968, Helen said, noticing Ryan looking at the photograph. "I served as a nurse in Vietnam. I was there when Thomas's unit was brought in after their rescue." Ryan's heart stopped. "You knew Thomas in Vietnam?" "I treated him for his gunshot wound. He was more worried about his dog than himself. Scout, the original Scout, died in my field hospital. Thomas held that dog for hours, crying like his heart was broken." Helen sat down across from Ryan and folded her hands in her lap. "Thomas never forgot that I tried to save his dog. When he moved to this neighborhood 20 years ago, he looked me up. We became good friends. Eleanor and I were very close too." "Mrs. Rodriguez, I need to tell you something important. Thomas asked you to take care of Scout if anything happened to him, didn't he?" Helen's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas made me promise to care for Scout, but the dog ran away before I could bring him home. I've been trying to earn his trust ever since." "How have you been trying to earn his trust?" Helen walked to her kitchen window and pointed toward a small shed in her backyard. "I've been leaving flowers and flags at Thomas's grave for months. I wanted Scout to know that I honored Thomas too." Ryan stared at Helen in amazement. "You've been leaving the tributes at Thomas's grave?" "Every few days. I know what those military symbols mean to veterans. I thought if Scout saw that I respected Thomas's service, he might eventually trust me." "But Mrs. Rodriguez, Scout has been placing items at the grave himself. Fresh roses, Purple Heart medals, buried photographs." Helen smiled sadly. "Officer Walsh, I've been watching Scout's nighttime journeys from my bedroom window. I've seen him retrieve items from different graves and arrange them at Thomas's headstone, but I've also been adding my own tributes." Ryan realized that he had been witnessing two separate memorial rituals: Scout's trained behaviors and Helen's efforts to honor her old friend. "Mrs. Rodriguez, why didn't you just approach Scout directly?" "Because I understood what Thomas had trained him to do. Scout needed to complete his mission before he could move on. Thomas told me about the special training he was giving Scout. He wanted Scout to honor Eleanor and the original Scout for as long as the dog felt it was necessary." Helen led Ryan to her back door and pointed toward the cemetery, which was visible in the distance. "Thomas's final words to me were, 'Scout will know when it's time to let go. He'll know when his duty is complete, and he can start living again.' Do you think that time has come? Look at him, Officer Walsh. Scout is dying from grief and exhaustion. His duty was to honor Thomas's memories, but Thomas would never have wanted Scout to sacrifice his own life." That afternoon, Ryan and Helen walked to the cemetery together. Scout sat in his usual position beside Thomas's grave, but Ryan could see that the dog was weaker than ever. His golden coat was dull and matted. His breathing was shallow. Helen approached Scout slowly and knelt down beside him. For the first time in months, Scout turned his head to look at someone other than the grave. "Hello, Scout," Helen said softly. "Thomas told me so much about you. He said you were the bravest dog he ever knew, just like your namesake." Scout's tail moved slightly, the first sign of life Ryan had seen from him in weeks. Helen reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a dog collar with a brass nameplate that read Scout and a phone number. "Thomas asked me to give this to you when you were ready," Helen said, showing the collar to Scout. "It belonged to your predecessor. Thomas kept it all these years." Scout sniffed the collar carefully. His ears perked up, and for the first time since Thomas's death, Scout's tail began to wag. Helen fastened the collar around Scout's neck. "Thomas wanted you to carry on the legacy of courage and loyalty, but he also wanted you to be happy. He would be so proud of how you've honored his memory." Scout looked back at Thomas's grave one final time, then stood up slowly. He walked to the headstone and placed his paw on the granite surface. A final salute from one soldier to another. Then Scout turned and walked toward Helen, his tail wagging weakly but steadily. "I live just 3 blocks from here," Helen told Scout as she attached a leash to his new collar. "You can visit Thomas every day, but now you'll have a warm bed and good food waiting for you at home." Dr. Sarah Kim met them at the cemetery entrance with medical supplies to examine Scout. The dog was severely underweight and dehydrated, but with proper care, he would recover completely. Scout has learned that honoring the past doesn't require sacrificing the future, Dr. Kim said as she finished her examination. That's a lesson Thomas would have wanted him to learn. Over the following weeks, Scout slowly returned to health under Helen's loving care. Every morning, Scout and Helen walked to the cemetery together. Scout would sit by Thomas's grave for an hour, maintaining his vigil, but no longer staying all day. Helen would visit Eleanor's grave and the original Scout's grave, bringing fresh flowers and keeping the memorial sites beautiful. She understood the importance of Scout's mission and made sure it continued in a healthy way. Ryan visited them regularly and watched Scout transform from a grieving, desperate animal into a happy, healthy dog who had found his purpose. Scout still performed his memorial duties, but now he also played fetch in Helen's backyard, greeted neighborhood children with tail wags, and slept peacefully on a soft bed every night. The story of Scout's loyalty spread throughout Cedar Rapids and beyond. Veterans from across Iowa came to visit Thomas's grave and meet the dog who had honored his owner's memory so faithfully. The Cedar Rapids VFW Post 1342 adopted Scout as their official mascot and featured his story in their newsletter. Scout's story became a symbol of the unbreakable bond between veterans and the animals who serve alongside them. Schools invited Helen and Scout to visit classes, where Helen would tell students about the importance of loyalty, duty, and caring for those who have served their country. Local newspapers wrote articles about Scout's devotion. A documentary, filmmaker from Des Moines, made a short film about Scout's story that was shown at veteran organizations across the Midwest. But the most important change was in Scout himself. The dog had learned that love and loyalty could continue without self-destruction. He had discovered that the best way to honor Thomas's memory was to live the kind of happy, purposeful life that Thomas had always wanted for him. Every morning, Scout and Helen would walk to Thomas's grave. Scout would sit quietly for a few minutes, as if reporting for duty and sharing the news of his new life. Then he would walk to Eleanor's grave and the original Scout's grave, paying his respects to the entire family that had shaped his identity. But every evening, Scout would return home, with Helen, where he belonged. He had learned that being faithful to the past didn't mean living in it forever. On warm summer evenings, Scout would lie in Helen's backyard and watch the sunset over the cemetery where his beloved Thomas rested. His tail would wag softly as neighborhood children played around him and Helen tended her garden. Scout had fulfilled his promise to Thomas. He had honored Eleanor's memory, respected the original Scout's sacrifice, and proved that love truly can transcend death. Now he was free to enjoy the gift that love had given him, a chance to live again. The golden Labrador, who had once sat motionless in grief, had become a living reminder that the greatest tribute to those we've lost is to embrace the life they wanted us to have. Scout's story would inspire people for years to come, showing that loyalty and love, when balanced with hope and healing, create the most beautiful memorials of all. In the end, Scout had done exactly what Thomas had trained him to do. He had kept faith with the past while building a bridge to the future. And in doing so, he had honored not just Thomas's memory, but the memory of all those who serve and sacrifice for the ones they love. We'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below and tell us your city or country. It's amazing to connect with viewers from around the world who share our love for these heartwarming stories. If Scout's story touched your heart, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for many more inspiring tales of loyalty, courage, and the incredible bonds between humans and animals. We share these stories to remind us all of the goodness that still exists in this world. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. In a time when the world can feel divided, stories like Scouts help spread kindness and awareness about the sacrifices our veterans have made and the amazing animals who stand by their side. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next story. Until then, remember, love and loyalty never truly die. They just find new ways to shine.